Okay, so a little bit of review before we read the passage. We talked about the possibility that when the woman, Eve, as her name now is, was naming her firstborn son, and whether or not Cain is literally the firstborn son, we're going to assume that he is, because the story introduces him as their first child, Adam and Eve. And we talked a little bit about the meaning of his name. I have acquired a man, Yahweh, and that the possibility was that Eve was viewing this son as the seed God promised in Genesis 3. Juxtapose that with the name Abel, which is breath, a short, quick breath of life the boy is going to have, is kind of the meaning of his name. And then we talked about the difference between offerings and sacrifices. And this is very important contextually with the story, because the story of Cain and Abel usually gets told that Cain's offering wasn't acceptable because he didn't bring a blood sacrifice. But that's perfectly fine, because an offering does not have to be a blood sacrifice. A sacrifice, of course, has to be a blood offering, and you can bring a blood offering as Abel does. But an offering is a perfectly free gift you're offering to God. It is no legal obligation to do it. If you're under an obligation by God to bring a sacrifice because you've sinned, this is what you give on the other side of that sacrifice. Your sins have been dealt with, and you just want to give God a gift. So the problem that we talked about was that it had nothing to do with Cain, what Cain brings. That's not the problem. The problem is with Cain as a person. He has the attitude of what I call the Dark Lord. He thinks that there's nothing wrong with him. He thinks there can't be anything wrong with his offering, that God is automatically supposed to accept it. And if he just does the offering, and just does the ritual offering, God has to accept it. But God doesn't have to do anything, and God doesn't accept it because his heart isn't in it. He's just all about the mechanical rituals of it. And now we're going to deal with the part of the story where Cain goes out, he kills Abel, and then we're going to talk about God's response to Cain. And what we want to zero in on tonight is these connections between Genesis 3 and what God has already said to Adam and Eve, the pattern that's set up, and how the same pattern is played out here. There is going to be a lot of similarities to Cain's sin and God's response to it to Adam and Eve. So Genesis is presenting us with a story that it wants us to connect to Genesis 3, and that's often not what happens. But let's read the passage again, and we'll start zeroing in on about verse 8, roughly. So Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. Later she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you so angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." When they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where's your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" Then the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crop for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you're driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence, and I will be a restless wonder on earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Oh. But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So, we're going to start, verse 8 is simple. Cain says, hey, let's go out into the field. He kills him. There's not much to deal with there. So let's really start in verse 9, which I label it July. Juliar! Because God asked him a question, where's your brother Abel? And like Genesis 3:19, where God says, where are you? God is basically, obviously he already knows the answer. He already knows Abel's dead. He already knows what Cain has done. So he's calling Cain to account and giving Cain the same opportunity to just outright confess what he's done wrong that he gave the man when he said, where are you? But instead, Abel being dead and Cain says, yeah, Abel's dead, I killed him. Cain, of course, just says, I don't know, which is a flat-out lie. Cain rejects accountability, which makes him like Adam and Eve in the previous chapter. However, unlike Adam and Eve, he just flat-out lies. Adam and Eve, they said, yes, I'm guilty, but it's not my fault, and they shift blame Adam to his wife, the wife to the serpent, right? So what you see here is the same order of things, but it's heightened. There's what's the term? It's devolving a little bit. One generation later, and people aren't hiding from God. They're more like proudly lying about their sins. And their sins have gone from eating a piece of fruit to murdering their brother. So, I don't know is a flat-out lie. And he says, am I my brother's keeper? Now, that word keeper should look familiar because it's already come up in chapters 2 and again, I think it's mentioned in chapter 3. Yes, when they're being kicked out of the garden, but I don't have that part on the slide. The Hebrew word is shamar, where when God makes man, he brings him to the garden to serve and keep the garden. And so you could translate this, am I my brother's guardian? And part of the answer is yes, you're the older brother. That's one thing. But also the human purpose to guard and protect life in Eden has not been done away with just because they're no longer living in Eden. They're exiled from the garden, but the purpose is completely upside down. Instead of serving, he's attacking. Instead of guarding, he's murdering. So the complete inverse of what humanity is meant to be is encompassed here by Cain, who I've described as the first dark lord, because in these following verses, he's the first liar to just flat out lie, but he's also the first to murder. And so he's completely upside down, and he's going to reject all accountability about it. So just pay attention to that right here from the beginning. Verses 10 through 12. This is where it gets into judgment, curse, and exile all over again. But let's start with the judgment. What the Lord said in verse 10, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So nothing's hidden from God. Justice for the bloodshed of an image bearer demands God's actions. So this is why God once again comes on the scene, tries to hold somebody accountable, but does not immediately forgive the sin. He judges the sin, which is exactly what he did in chapter 3. But something worse than mere, I shouldn't say it like that. It's not mere rebellion in chapter 3. But murder is a heightened form of rebellion against God than eating forbidden fruit. Now, Cain has polluted the ground, so the consequences are going to involve the ground, which takes us back to the judgment on the man. Cursed is the ground because of you. Thorns and thistles it will produce. By the sweat of your brow you will eat of it all the days of your life until you return to the dust. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. We've already covered that ground, pun intended. Always mean and intend your puns. Not intending your puns is a form of weakness, okay? Always intend your puns. So, and this is a lot of actual Hebrew wordplay and punnery going on if you just follow the ground language. So, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And so verse 11, now you are under a curse and driven from the ground. So, a couple of things to note here that follow the pattern of Genesis 3. Like his parents in chapter 3, Cain himself isn't cursed. This doesn't say, cursed are you. It says, the NIV has chose to translate it, you're under a curse. What does that mean? We'll come back to it in a little bit, in a moment more specifically. But he himself isn't cursed. He's under a curse. He will be driven out from this ground as the man was driven out from the garden. So, what happens in chapter 3 is happening in the next generation. So, the first generation of humanity has its mistakes and consequences. Now that we're living in exile as a species from God's presence in the garden, those consequences aren't going away. And in fact, as the next generation makes its own mistakes, things are going to get worse. They're going to devolve. And this is the beginning of it. Now, as he's driven from the ground, it likely means that Cain will not be able to remain in the location that he is in. He has polluted that space, and so he must be exiled from that space. I don't think it means he can never stay in one place, which is how some people take it. And in fact, I think that's how Cain takes it. God says you will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and yet Cain goes out, builds a city, and as far as the story is concerned, lives the rest of his life in that city. So it doesn't mean that he can't put down roots necessarily, but it does mean that wherever this location is in relation to his family, he can't stay there anymore. He's going to be exiled from the life that he's built up to this point. It at least means that much. That may not be all that it means, but at least means that much. This language of verse 11, you are under a curse. It's actually very close in Hebrew construct to the words God spoke to the serpent. Cursed are you above all livestock, but it still doesn't say cursed are you, Cain. It's closer than that. Some would go so far as to translate it, cursed are you from the ground, meaning God's not cursing the ground. But I think the NIV is kind of clever here. You're under a curse gets the fact that God's not cursing Cain right, but also it's a little awkward because what does it mean to be under a curse without being cursed? And you kind of have to know your Pentateuch. Deuteronomy, 27, where God says, if you don't choose blessing, you're going to choose curse. You'll be under a curse in the sense that I'll send 100 of your soldiers out to fight 5 guys, and they'll turn around and they'll beat all 100 of you. You'll plant all these seeds in the ground, and nothing will grow up. If you don't choose to make me your sole God, if you cheat on me with other gods, you will be under a curse. Curses will overtake your life. It's that kind of notion. I think it's Deuteronomy 27. I don't have it on the slides, but you can go look up the blessings and the curse chapters in Deuteronomy. The blessings chapter is kind of short, and the curse chapter is much, much longer and much more graphic. It goes into much more detail. It's kind of that same idea. You're not going to be cursed, but your life is not going to go well. But the reason it sounds and is written in Hebrew so similar to the serpent is because the author's trying to make a connection to the serpent. Cain, instead of being the serpent defeating seed his mother might have thought him to be when she names him, has instead decided he's going to join the serpent's side in the cosmic battle. I told you, I theorized that the serpent was trying to force God's hand and put humanity to death by getting them to eat the fruit, right? Here's someone who has actually put humanity to death. Cain. He's playing right into the serpent's will. He's acting like the serpent, and God is talking to him like the serpent because he's showing himself to be on the serpent's side. Now, we talked about this. Humanity, Adam and Eve, are in Genesis 3, they're linked to the serpent. They're on the serpent's side, which is why they cannot be allowed to reach out in the garden and eat the fruit of the tree of life, because they can't live forever in rebellion against God. They'll stand no chance of redemption if they don't face the consequences and be driven out of the garden into exile. But the story is, I'm telling you, built in such a way to make sure that you as a reader can understand Cain is the human embodiment of the serpent. And if his mother thought that he might be the seed, then for the first time in the Bible, we get an option of who the seed is going to be, who does the opposite of what the seed is supposed to do. And that will become a pattern throughout the Bible. Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, just as Cain is Adam and Eve's firstborn son, is going for 13 years of his life assumed to be the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promises. And yet God is going to walk right past him and promise the birth of Isaac through Sarah, who has never had a child and is well beyond childbearing age, and say, nope, I'm going to bless Ishmael. He's not under a curse, but Ishmael is not going to be the seed. Ishmael hasn't disqualified himself the way Cain has, but usually the pattern is going to be, in the next generation from Isaac and Ishmael on, Isaac's two sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau is going to treat his rights as firstborn very frivolously. He doesn't care about the responsibility of carrying on the Abrahamic promises, so he sells his birthright for a pot of stew. Right? He doesn't take it seriously. And you're going to start seeing over and over again, if you know to look for it, stories in the Bible where God is going to call someone towards something, or somebody's going to be assuming responsibility like the firstborn son, and for one reason or another, they're going to disqualify themselves. These are the Abrahamic promises passed on, and Israel becomes the bearer collectively of the Abrahamic promises, and then they're going to turn around to God after God after God, and they're going to fail to fulfill their promises. This is like Samson, who's going to be a judge from the time that he's born, a Nazirite from birth, but he's never going to take his Nazirite call seriously. You know what Samson is? Samson is a spoiled brat and a man whore. That's what Samson is. Because he's a womanizer, he goes around hooking up with pagan women, trying to marry one of them, and when that fails, he just shacks up with the whore, because he's a man whore himself. But he's also touching dead bodies, which you can't do as a Nazirite. He's drinking wine and partying and celebrating and stuff, which you're not supposed to do as a Nazirite. He's a Nazirite so long as he doesn't cut his hair, and yet he breaks every vow upon it. He's like this promised guy who doesn't live up to the promise because he doesn't take his responsibility seriously. And that will be the pattern over and over again. God will call Saul to be king, and yet Saul doesn't think he needs to obey God. He thinks God needs to obey him, and it doesn't work that way. So Saul loses the kingship, passes it to David. David will do the best job of taking this seriously, despite all of his faults. David, and we talked about this a couple of Wednesdays ago. The one line David will not cross is he will not worship another god. He will play the man whore. David's weakness is women. Let's not kid ourselves about that. He's got too many wives, too many princely brat sons, but who are infighting. But David's weakness is women, and it comes back to bite him. He has a weakness for power. He tries to count the army and the military men to go well beyond his established boundaries as king. And his advisors try and talk him out of it, but he does it anyways. And he gets in trouble with that. And God spends 3 days wiping out people around the city of David itself. And so you see the pattern. Once again, he's failing on some level. However, what makes David the ideal king is no matter what he does wrong, he doesn't worship another god. And when he does wrong, he comes back to God and pays for it. He accepts judgment. He responds to judgment and accountability differently than guys like Cain. But you see with David's sons, if you read the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, that in the book of Kings, the kings of Israel, none of them are good. But in the kings of Judah in Kings and Chronicles, which only chronicles the kings of Judah in the south, some of them are at least good. However, they all fail in one way or another. No matter how good they are, they all fail. So the Old Testament ends with the question, who's the seed? Who's the promised Messiah? And it gives us no answer. It just says he's still coming. And then you turn the page and you get Matthew telling the story of Israel in the person of Jesus in such a way where he goes into the wilderness and is tempted in all of Israel's same temptations in Exodus and Numbers, and yet passes all of the tests, passes all the temptations. And so ultimately the seed that we've talked about is Christ, because he will succeed where everybody fails, including Adam and including Adam's son Cain. So Cain is under a curse, identifying him as a serpent-like person, following the serpent's will, not God's will. And the consequences of it is, instead of being blessed, the opposite of blessing is curse. He's under a curse, and that curse is you're going to be driven from the land. Now, Cain is a farmer by trade. This is his job. This is how he makes his living. So he's going to be cut off from the means of living because he cut off the life of Abel. This is the idea. He's going to have to find a new way to survive, and I mean that occupationally. And I think this is, when it says driven from the ground, I think that's what this means. Which should lead you, if you go and you read the next passage in here, why he kind of goes out and builds a city and starts gathering people around him. If he can't farm and the ground will no longer yield its crops to him, he's got to find a new way to make a living. So he builds a city, closes himself off in it, and starts living off of other people. Kingship, right? Okay. So this part of the judgment suggests that as a farmer, he's planted a seed in the earth. And that seed is his baby brother. Whoops, not a good seed. It's an unlawful thing to plant, so the ground is rejecting Cain by no longer producing anything for him anymore. He said, okay, you planted your baby brother as a seed. We don't accept that, and we will reject anything else that you put in us. The ground is kind of being personified. The ground is now going to fight Cain entirely, which is different than what happened in Genesis 3. So the ground that opened its mouth to receive Abel from Cain will no longer open its mouth and receive anything else from Cain. And this is different. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops to you. Then it's different than Genesis 3:18, where man produces thorns and thistles, but he also gets his food. You're going to produce some things that you cannot eat, but the ground will still produce food for you. But for Cain, God's apparently saying, no more food for you. However you're going to get food, it's not going to come from the ground, which doesn't mean he's going to die. Other people can grow his food for him, which I think is part of how he compensates by a city, but he can also eat animals. He can still eat meat. That's still a thing. And so, but he can't make his living. Whatever he's built into his life economically up to this point, he's done. And he's going to have to find another way around that. Yes, his punishment is more severe because his crime is more severe. Severity is a hard thing to classify, but I think based on the judgment here, yes, Adam and Eve did wrong. Adam did the most wrong because he knew what God had said, and we talked about that in relation to Eve. But this guy has ended the life of another guy for the first time. So the consequences have to reflect that. So I want you to see the idea. He planted his brother into the ground unlawfully, so the consequences are no more ground-producing good stuff for you. It's not just, it's not going to be 75% thorns and thistles and 25% food. It's going to be 100% nothing. It's not even thorns and thistles. So my conclusion to this is that Cain will no longer produce anything, which is far worse than God's judgment to Adam in 3:18. It's better to produce thorns and thistles and still be able to produce edible food than for the ground to just suddenly reject you and never for you to grow anything. And at this point, we don't know anything about masonry or stone masonry, but it's going to be Cain's descendants in the city who seemingly come up with stuff like that. The stone masonry doesn't come up. You get metal workers, you get musicians in the city. So and those are not portrayed negatively, despite the fact that the city is not seemingly a good place. But the stone masonry that we seem to get in its modern forms actually comes up at Babel. Slightly different. There probably is a pre-existing masonry around this time. And hey, he could do something like that. And if he builds a city, it's entirely possible that that's a part of it that we just don't know about. Okay, so he's going to face judgment. He's now going to not be cursed, but under a curse, and the curse is his occupation is done. He'll never be able to grow another thing. Now he must go into exile. God says you'll be a restless wanderer. You'll be unable to plant roots anywhere because you can't maintain a living by farming because of your broken connection to the ground. So, literally, you can't plant roots, meaning you can't plant crops. So you're not going to be able to stay in one place long enough for a year's cycle of cropping, tilling the ground, planting seeds, and harvest, growing them all the way to harvest season. You're not going to be able to do that. The restless wanderer is to say you can go from place to place, but you're never going to be there long enough to actually grow crops. Okay? So this is what happens when you're an abusive person. You can't put down roots. All abusive people have similar patterns. They use up social resources until they have to move on to a new social group. Because they take, they use, and they use and use and use until everyone is being used by them. And then they use up everyone. And when they have nobody else to use, they have to move on to another group, another location, another city. You will see this with the worst of politicians. When the worst of politicians can't get their constituents to vote for them anymore, they turn to a new group of politicians. Preachers that go from church to church and cannot stick roots down and last more than 3 or 5 years, which is becoming a more and more common trend in modern times. What? 3 to 5 years, yes. The number of preachers that actually stick with the church beyond like 7 years is statistically below 10% these days. It's ridiculous. Exactly, that's the thing, and it's not always a pastor's fault. Sometimes the church just isn't ready to follow a shepherd where he wants to go, so they drive him out, and oftentimes it's not his fault. But oftentimes, if you're an abusive person and you're just there to use the sheep for your own ends, you can't last because the sheep know they're being used, and sometimes that's why they drive you out, and sometimes you just have to leave because there's nobody else left to use. My pastor in Gonzales was kind of like this. He had a revolving door of people in the church. About 50 people would leave at a time, and he'd get a new group of 50 people in for about 3 to 5 years. Now, he had been there for 10 years when I started, so he was there 15 years when I left. But it was not the same group of people in the church because he had massive turnover about every year, 50 people would leave. 50, so he had the same numbers for all that time, but people don't like being abused, and they was like, well, I don't have to stay here, so they just go on to the next church. And so he goes out and finds another group and pulls them in. It is a pattern, and it's the standard of being an abuser, and Cain is setting the standard here. As a restless wanderer, you're going to view people as your playthings, or that you can use them as you wish, including your own family, your little brother. How are you going to treat people that you're not even related to, right? Imagine how bad it is. And yet, people are still going to follow him, and he's still going to build up a city. So, there's some possible wordplay here. I say possible, it's pretty likely. A broken connection with the Adamah, the Hebrew word for land or ground here, is also a broken connection to Adam, to mankind. Adam is both a proper name and a word for humanity in Genesis 2 and 3. And here, both of these words appear, and the wordplay is because of your broken connection to the ground, you're also going to have a broken connection with people. You've broken both. By breaking your connection with your brother and putting him in the ground, your connection with humanity itself is broken, and that is a implied but not explicit consequence of abusing people. And I think it's important to point that out here, because you can see that pattern play out with abusers down to this day. And it's starting right here with Cain. All right, that's verses 10 through 12. Let's talk about verses 13 and 14. Cain's response to God's judgment and his exile. Verse 13 is where Cain says, my punishment is more than I can bear. That's the first expression. Is Cain expressing remorse when he says, my punishment is more than I can bear? I agree. I don't think he is. Now, because if I were to paraphrase this, based on the Hebrew, because this isn't a bad translation of it, it's just, this is a very historical way that this has been translated in English, so it kind of gets passed down to it. I think if I were to paraphrase it, I would think he was saying something like, that's not fair. Because I think this is his tone and his attitude. He's not expressing remorse. I think he's upset that he got caught. So even after God has caught him in his lies and the death of his brother, he's not actually admitting that he's done anything wrong. He does not say, I sinned, as some people will even when they get caught. Not only does he not say it here, he never says it anywhere, ever, because I don't think he feels remorse. I see nothing in all of Cain's words or his subsequent actions in chapter 4 to suggest that he felt any remorse, let alone repent for murdering his brother. This is why I think he's a dark lord. Someone who does not ever learn their lesson because they think they're special and they have nothing to learn. Which makes more sense of his response here as something like, God, you're punishing me too much. Stop it. I didn't do that badly. Come on, people are going to find me and kill me. Yeah. So instead of expressing remorse, like many of us, he's just upset that he got caught, and he's upset that he's being punished for his crimes. Yes. What he did. Yeah, he's not upset about his crimes. He's upset that he's being punished for his crimes. Like a year and a half, 2 years ago now, I forget how long ago it was. There was a guy who was in court, and you could look this up if I could remember his name. But he was being sentenced by the judge, and he'd been found guilty. And he said, Your Honor, I'm sorry for what I've done, and I don't think I should be punished for it. He said, I'm paraphrasing, he said something like that. And the judge says, well, I'm glad you're sorry for what you've done, but you still have to be punished for it. And then he immediately said, well, you son of a... And he started rushing the judge, and his lawyer and his bailiff had to restrain him and stuff. It's that kind of attitude. But Cain's not even going so far as to feign that he's sorry. If you read this, the Hebrew tone really is, how dare you, God? That's not fair. How can you punish me for this? So he's not sorry he committed those crimes. He's upset that he got caught. This idea fits the context better. This is more in keeping with the story. The Hebrew NIV translation, my punishment is more than I can bear. It's not bad, but it's a little obscure. My punishment is more than I can bear is translated. That's way beyond what I did wrong. And it's like, you killed someone, Cain. And so you can see he's not owning up to that. He's just upset that he got caught. So I don't think Cain's expressing any remorse. He's expressing surprise. Surprise that there are consequences to his actions. Because however old he is when this happens, he's still basically a 4-year-old kid who's never learned to play nice with others, right? Or at least he's turned back into a 4-year-old kid when his face falls in the previous verses. His countenance falls. His attitude changes. I think he seems to think it's unfair that he's driven from the ground, that he's hidden from God's presence, that he will now be a restless wanderer, that he will always be under threat of being killed himself. I think he might ironically be complaining to God that he's the victim of such cruel and unjust judgments and threats. Oh, God, you're going to make me a restless wanderer? Come on, man. That's the idea. He's like, oh, he doesn't even mention the fact that he killed his brother, but he's like, in the back of his head, he's like, Abel's just dead. What's so bad about that? I'm being driven from the ground. I'm being hidden from your presence. I'm going to be a restless wanderer. Everybody who finds me will attack me and kill me. And he's never once actually stops to think, do I deserve that? Should I respond to this judgment, to this exile in a... Yeah, he did read the Ten Commandments, but... That doesn't mean he doesn't know what's wrong. So I think this is much more in keeping with the tone of verses 13 and 14 and how he's responding to God's judgment, curse, and exile. Which brings us to verses 15 and 16. God is still going to have a gracious response to Cain and his evil self. Verse 15, the NIV translates it not so. I would probably translate that fine. Very well, something along those lines. Okay, then here's my response to you, Cain. That's the idea of verse 15, because it's parallel to 3:21, where God provides animal skins for the human beings leaving the garden. So in the same way, he's going to graciously prepare Cain from exile from his familial community. You're not going to be able to stay where you're at. You're not going to be able to farm anymore. You're going to be sent away, but I'm not going to send you away empty-handed. God is interested very much in keeping the cycle of violence that Cain has started from expanding out. So, hence verse 15, if anybody takes vengeance on you, I'll take vengeance on him 7 times over for you. He wants to end the cycle of violence, so he provides protection for Cain through some visible form, some mark that he puts on Cain. What is the mark of Cain? Don't know, don't care. God doesn't tell us. It's not there. I don't know. I don't care. I don't think the author of Genesis knew. He knew there was a mark. He didn't know what it is. Let's not get bogged down on that. Instead, I want you to see the same thing that existed in Genesis 3. The graciousness of God to promise a seed to overcome and redeem the serpent, overcome and defeat the serpent, and redeem mankind. In the midst of judgment, God is always gracious. He is not strictly justice. He is justice tempered with mercy. He doesn't strictly say, Cain, you're a murderer, now you'll die. He says, you've murdered, you're wrong, and these are the consequences, but you think they're not fair? Fine, I'll protect you. I'll see that you go on living your life and nobody puts you to death. And the implied idea, are you ready to repent now, Cain? How much grace do I have to give you before you start agreeing with me that your consequences for your sins is actually good and right? And of course, Cain doesn't respond to anything here. He doesn't say, oh, okay, thank you, God. Also, I'm sorry I killed my brother. Thank you for letting me live. I'll go be a restless wanderer now. No, he doesn't do any of that. The language of verse 16 suggests that Cain fully and consciously is abandoning God's kingly rule when he goes east to live in the land of Nod. Nod is the Hebrew word for wanderer. So he goes and he lives in the land of wandering. It's a Hebrew pun. He went off and he wandered east. until he eventually found a spot and started building a city and started living off other people probably. So again, he just kind of, in verse 16, verse 15, he's given this gracious mark. He's graciously allowed to live unlike his brother. So God is more gracious to him than he was to Abel. And yet, no point in this grace does he ever actually say thank you, express remorse, repent. He just goes off and starts wandering around the land east of Eden. So this recalls the exile in chapter 3. Adam and Eve are banished. But here it's heightened because the idea of he went out from the presence of the Lord. Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden. Cain, the language seems to imply something like he just decided he was going to get up and walk away from God's presence. Again, furthering the idea that he is not sorry for murder. He wants to go away where God's laws and rules can't get him. Okay, now I'm going to give you a foreshadow of where we're going at the back end of this to close us off. So, east of Eden, things are going to get worse. The bloodline of Adam via Cain is going to continue through Cain in the world's first city, but we're going to get the negative idea of a city. At least in the book of Genesis, and this is not the case throughout the Bible, but at least in Genesis, cities and urban areas are usually painted in negative, suggestive lights because they don't attract the godliest of people. We've been through this on Sunday morning with Sodom and Gomorrah. It's the same idea. They attract people like Cain and his descendants. So as we close off this year tonight with Cain, I hope you see the same patterns: sin, judgment, curse, exile, but also grace, also mercy, and the potential for redemption. But, spoilers for Cain, he and really his descendants in the rest of the chapter, like, they've wandered away from God. They don't want anything to do with him.